housing is too expensive. Prices have skyrocketed in the United Kingdom since the middle of the last century. They've risen faster than wages. They have risen faster than inflation. Expensive housing damages people's lives, from the minimum wage worker who spends half of their salary to rent a mouldy bedroom in a flat share, to the young couple who have to move away from their friends and family in the city if they want to afford enough space to have children. Expensive housing is bad for our economy. It prevents people from moving to where job opportunities are. It represents a direct transfer of wealth from renters who are typically younger and lower income to homeowners who are typically older and higher income. Worsening housing affordability is not unique to the UK. There are many cities, regions, and countries around the world that face similar challenges, but not all of them. What determines whether or not a place has worsening housing affordability? Now, there are many factors that affect the cost of housing, everything from rising population, rising incomes and demand for space, to the cost of credit. But if we look at international evidence, there is one key factor that determines whether or not a place is able to control house price inflation. Places that build more homes relative to their demand have cheaper housing. UK, and London specifically, is extremely poor at providing enough homes and has been so for a very long time. On the other hand, there are places that have managed to control house price inflation for the most part. Places like Tokyo in Japan or Houston in Texas. So why don't we simply build more homes here? It's not that we don't have enough space. Only around 6% of England is developed on, and mostly at very low densities. There's no shortage of materials, there's no shortage of labour, there's no shortage of finance. What there is, however, is a set of policies that make it complex, risky, and therefore difficult to build. London, for instance, is constrained outwardly by an enormous green belt, where you cannot build homes as a general rule. Contrary to its name, it's not an environmental designation. It actually includes a lot of land that has been previously developed, including petrol stations and car parks. It was introduced in the middle of the 20th century in order to prevent London from expanding and to redirect its population growth to new towns and cities, only a few of which were ever introduced. London is constrained outwards, but also upwards. It's built at very low densities compared to other European cities, and there are height limits through policy in many areas. Other places that have poor housing affordability have similar policies. So there's a pretty broad consensus amongst economists that we can fix housing affordability by reducing or removing some of these policies. But the problem is not economic, it's political. And to understand why, we have to look at why these planning systems or land use systems were introduced in the first place. They were designed to prevent negative externalities, that is, negative impacts of new building on local communities. As an example, imagine you live in a sleepy, charming village, and your neighbour decides he wants to knock down his house and build a slaughterhouse. You won't want that, and you might well think that a slaughterhouse would be better placed further down the road, away from the village and away from people. And many people would be inclined to agree with you. So these systems were introduced for a good reason, but they do have one key flaw. The benefits of new house building, improving affordability, are widely dispersed across a region. They benefit renters marginally per new unit built. But the downsides of building are all concentrated. Anything from the noise of construction to the additional pressure on amenities to additional traffic in the area. They're all experienced by local people. Local people, by definition, live in the area already. They already have homes. They can probably afford those homes. They don't need new ones. But they do experience all of the downsides of building. So they pressure their politicians. They lobby them to prevent the housing being built. And at local levels, this kind of pressure can have electoral impact. So politicians join these campaigns. They lobby against new housing being built. And importantly, they also push back against any policy reform to make it easier to build. So how do we fix it? Recently, the OECD published a report about better housing policy. It highlighted that highly localized planning systems tend to result in worse housing affordability. They recommended that government move planning decisions from the local level to the regional or metropolitan level in order to prevent this political problem. So local power is normally used to prevent housing being built. You may be surprised then to know that I'm about to suggest you can also use local housing to get more homes built. This idea takes its inspiration from the late Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. She looked at the tragedy of the commons. This is the problem that common resources can be overused if everyone uses them freely. The classic example is a shepherd who wants to graze his flock on the common land. If all of the shepherds do this, that common land will quickly be degraded and overgrazed. But Ostrom demonstrated that societies often do negotiate the use of shared resources so that everyone benefits and those resources are preserved. So how do we apply this idea to house building? Landowners have a huge financial incentive to get a planning permission for the largest possible property. If you own a suburban detached home and you were to knock it down and build a block of flats, in London that could be worth hundreds of thousands or even millions of pounds to you. Even if you aren't going to do the building yourself, that planning permission has value. But you also don't want your neighbour to have that same permission. If your neighbour knocks down his house and builds a block of flats, that's going to bother you, it's going to cause you inconvenience, and it may also reduce the value of your own home. So what if we allowed these two neighbours to collectively agree to allow development? For instance, I build an extra story on my home, you build an extra story on yours. We both benefit. You could have a row of neighbours who demolished their semi-detached homes and built a mansion block. So this policy would allow us to build upwards, but with local consent. London is built at extremely low densities, as I've said. This idea solves the political problem, not just the economic one. I have here a picture of a typical outer London suburban street. And here's an example of what it could look like. So how do we implement it? Now, this is actually relatively easy and already does happen to an extent at the relatively small scale. People often consent to their neighbours building extensions on their homes because they're on good terms with each other. But this doesn't result in the scale of housing supply that we need. And it's more challenging on a larger scale. There are more people affected by any decisions. They all want a veto right. Some people may try and withhold their engagement in order to get a better offer. Some people may simply reject change of any kind. So I suggest a street vote system. Streets are a good unit to work with because you can set rules at the regional level about how high you can go and set back from the street in order to prevent it impinging on surrounding streets. These streets could have a 2/3 majority vote in order to allow additional development. They could set design codes to ensure that any new development built meets certain standards of appearance. After voting on this, the landowner would not need to implement their permission immediately. They could sell their home on, they can do as they please. It's worth a lot of money either way. And if, like me, you're a renter, why would you vote in favour of your landlord getting a planning permission for a taller property? Obviously, over the longer run, you would benefit in terms of lower house prices from additional housing supply to more choice. But in the shorter term, obviously, there's a risk that you would be evicted for works. But there's a relatively simple mechanism that you could introduce, that any tenant living within the property within the last 2 years either has to consent to any redevelopment or has to be compensated with at least a year's rent. This means the landlord has an incentive to simply pay them out rather than evicting them. A typical suburban homeowner in London could increase the square footage of their home by as many as 5 times. This could easily create millions of new homes if they were to build blocks of flats, granny flats, and so on, or simply larger homes for their families. And it does so while keeping everyone happy. Why not build more like this? This was actually only built in the 1980s. There's nothing to stop us doing this more except policy. So why do I think this will work? As a YIMBY campaigner, a Yes in My Backyard campaigner, I have seen directly how opposed people are to building new homes in their area. For every proposed development, there's 100 possible reasons that local people will object to it, and they do. But this idea has several merits. It's popular, community-driven, and democratic, People will only vote in favour of doing so if they want to. They're not being forced. There's no opposing coalition in policy. In the world of UK housing policy, there is loads of competing factions, each with their own views about how things should be done. But none of them really oppose this street vote policy for the reasons I've already said. It's democratic, it's community-driven. And we've already seen, by speaking to politicians, that actually attracts fairly broad popular support across parties. It's easy to trial and implement. We can trial it in a small area and see if it does work. It will allow you to increase housing stock and improve housing affordability, but it also allows you to improve it. Much of London's housing and England's housing was built in the middle of the last century to relatively low build standards. We could rebuild them to contemporary build standards. We could make housing better. We actually have some of the oldest stock in Europe, and that is probably why we have so much mould. It allows for organic growth, the same way our beautiful cities evolved historically. And it also allows for sustainable growth because the incentive to build upwards is higher, closer to existing public transport. It ensures that new homes provided have access to amenities because they're built in existing suburbs. And it also will generate a lot of tax intake to fund more amenities for those new residents. And lastly, it allows us to reduce pressure on undeveloped land. It allows us to make more with the land we are using already. So to summarise, housing affordability is one of the major political challenges of our time. And it's mainly a feature of badly designed laws, which are very, very difficult to change. But we can fix it by making use of communities' willingness to work with each other to negotiate mutually agreeable outcomes. We have nothing to lose by trying. Thank you.